The ravens came on a wind that had teeth. They clung to the eaves of the great hall of Winterfell and shook the wet from their wings while the rest of the courtyard muttered and stamped and blew rings of pale steam into the cold air. Ned Stark opened the second one with a thumbnail, careful of the old wax so he might preserve the impression of a crow's foot for Maester Luwin to examine. The parchment was thin, rubbed with soot to make the cramped letters stand out, the hand steady and neat despite the message's urgency. Benjen wrote of the wood darkening in ways beyond song and rumor, of rangers who did not return, of dead things that moved badly like men walking in dreams, of an offer few men of the Watch would dare put to the page. Ned let the hall idle about him. Catelyn went on speaking softly to Tommen's wet nurse about the child's cough, while Robb and Theon wrestled near the fire in boyish roughness that drew a growl from Grey Wind and laughter from the men at table. The familiar warmth of the hearth and the smell of bread should have comforted him. Even the godswood had been generous this season. Those old, red leaves had taken a shine of frost in morning and looked like banners cut from rubies. Yet the letters drained the hall of color. He read them again before passing them to Luwin, who pursed his lips the way he did when he feared what his duty would force him to say next. "Your brother speaks of strange tracks," Luwin said. "Hooves that leave no prints after the first 10 paces, as if the ground tires of remembering. There is mention of a dead hunter seated upright like a sentinel beneath a tree, his skin pale as milk and his eyes, well," he glanced at the page, "blue as stars." Ned was not a man given to superstition, but he did not hold much with dismissing the tales that clung to the north like frost to a door latch. "Winter remembers, old Nan used to say, and the memories it favors are not gentle." "There is more," Ned said. The maester, soft with worry, nodded. "Benjen asks you come north. He says the Lord Commander is—" Luwin hunted for a respectful word and found none that fit. "Practical. But there is division among the stewards and builders over what must be done with the free folk. And this—" He touched the second letter with a finger as cautious as if it were a coal. "The talk of a peace, of making an agreement not only with petty chiefs and raiders, but with whomever it is the free folk take for a king now." Catelyn, who heard more than she ever let on, lifted her eyes from the nurse. "The Watch aims to make peace with the wildlings?" The word she used was common in the south. In the north they said free folk with a certain proud misgiving. "I thought the Watch took their vows to keep them out." "The Watch's vows are to shield the realms of men," Ned said. The phrase had weight the way a sword has weight, familiar and grave. If the threat comes from something not easily called men, and the free folk could be persuaded to keep their axes turned the same way as ours. Catelyn's mouth tightened. "You are not truly thinking." "I am thinking of my brother," he said, more sharply than he meant to, then gentled it with a hand on her wrist. "And of Jeor Mormont, and of too few men on too long a wall. I am thinking of hunters and little villages in the Gift, the ones flickering like candle flames beneath a drafty door. The North cannot afford a flood of raiders, while the Watch looks for blue-eyed ghosts in the dark. The realm cannot afford to look away from its borders," Catelyn said, stubborn but not unkind. "But the crown has never blessed a thing like this. The free folk do not bow to kings, or so they say." "Everyone bows to something," Ned said, "or they break against it." She knew him then, in the tilt of his voice, and she sighed and looked toward the windows where the ravens tugged and pecked. "You mean to ride?" "I mean to ride light and quick, with Jory and Harwin and a handful of men I trust to keep their heads." He had already chosen them in his heart. "Roderick will see to the castle. If the passes are kind, we can be to Castle Black before the third snow. And if the passes are not kind, we will be there when we are meant to be." Catelyn's fingers were warm beneath his, the only warmth that mattered. "Bring our boys no stories of blood. They are too full of their own." He thought of Robb's red cheeks and Jon's watchful silences in the yard, of Theon's laugh, brittle and loud. "I will bring them a story of law," he said, "if the old gods will have it." The road north was the old road, stamped by feet that had belonged to men who remembered names like Torrin, Theon the Hungry Wolf, and Brandon the shipwright before it was a jest in a warming room. The hoarfrost held the ground like a pelt. Ned took the King's Road to the Bar Rolands and then the hard way through the long lake and to the moors beyond. The gray herds of elk moved along the horizon, and twice they saw a shadow the size of a hull slipping along the lakeside and heard it blow, a low dragonish snort in the fog, and Harwin murmured something to the nameless gods of the fawn. Jory rode a horse that could have been carved from old oak, steady as any watchman. "I don't like the quiet," he said, as if by saying so he could shatter it. "Even the birds mind their tongues up here." "They mind their bellies," Harwin said. "If you had wings, you'd be south before winter's first belch." Ned rode a gray mare that had never balked at ice. He held in his mind the shape of the wall the way a map holds the lines of a shore. He had seen it as a boy and twice as a man, but it lived in him as a thing greater than seeing. A barrier made by hands that had not known steel in this shape, ice-hewn and hammered by magics the world no longer admitted to common speech. At Queen's Crown they saw the ruined tower and the bent king's crown the small folk had nailed to a stump, and Jory spat and said kings and crowns had little to do with keeping warm. At Mole's Town, the ale was thin as well water and the women smiled the quick smiles of women who wanted to sleep in a bed that didn't walk. They rode on before dawn with a loaf between them, hard and gray, which Harwin gnawed like a mastiff unchecked by higher company. When the wall rose at last, it was less like a thing made than a thing the land had thrust up in its anger, an abrupt end to the north and to the south as well, for Ned felt as small before it as any boy. The late light touched it with a fever glow, and the ice answered back in cold fire. The lift creaked on its chains and the wind came down off the top like a magistrate's judgment. Castle Black was as he remembered and not. The yard held a mess of men drilling with their spears, a few in mail, more in patched leathers, the odd one bare-armed with scars that had their own geography. Smells of tallow and old onions came from the kitchens, and a black-faced boy poured hot water on the churnstones as if scouring time itself. Some faces turned to watch the riders. Some looked down as if the sight of men with names and homes pained them. Benjen was there, the snow in his hair making him look older and younger both. He caught Ned's leg and nearly pulled him off the mare in an embrace that grunted both of them. "You came," he said, and in his voice Ned heard the unspoken thank you and the apology too. "I came," Ned agreed, giving him a brother's grin. "You sent ravens with teeth. I could hardly refuse." "Come see the old bear," Benjen said. "The talk he's been eating sits poorly with him." Gior Mormont was a bear in truth to Ned's eye, not for his size only but for the way he filled space, claiming it without apology. He had a scar like a shallow river over one brow and lice in his beard so numerous he combed with a knife. He stood when Ned entered, which Ned would have spared him, for men at the wall stood constantly before cold, hunger, and indifference. He deserved a chair. Maester Eamon sat with him, a pale old pearl with the shadow of a young man still clinging to his skull. His blind eyes were milky as spring runoff when the snow melts too quickly to be kind. "My lord of Winterfell," Gior said, and his hand was hard where it clasped Ned's forearm. "You are as stubborn as they say." "We share a tongue for stubbornness, Lord Commander," Ned said. "I know only too well that it saves men's lives, until it gets them killed." Eamon made a sound like a raven in a barley field. "So do all virtues. Sit, Lord Stark. You'll only make me feel smaller than I already am." They spoke without fuss. Benjen poured ale that tasted of damp cloth. The talk began with supplies and ended with what had brought Ned north. Gior did not like the word peace. He did not like the word treaty any better. He liked the words watch, oath, and wall. To his thinking they were plain and they were sufficient. "The free folk smell weakness like a dog smells blood," Gior said. "They are men and women like us, but their mercy is like their summer. It does not last. They have children," Ned said. "They have old mothers they carry in sleds. They do not want to freeze any more than we do. They do not want to kneel," Gior said. "Light lowers to the level of the lake it fills," Eamon murmured. "If the lake is clean, it reflects heaven. If it is muddy, you see only yourself. Forgive an old man." Lord Stark, the better the terms, the better the men who answer them. You can make a pact only if it frames men at their best. Benjen leaned over the map the builders had scraped on the table. Mance Rayder knows better songs than any free folk I've met, he said. He learned them here, when the Watch raised him from a boy to a man. He learned law the same way. He left because he wouldn't abandon a cloak given to him by a spearwife who patched him up in a cave beneath a hill of bones. He left for pride as much as love.
Benjen glansde opp ned.
I think there's hope in a man who loves without shame. Gior grunted. Hope is a thing you warm your hands around until the wind puts it out. The wind puts it out more quickly when you cup your hands too tight, Eamon said, teasing. It brought the ghost of a smile to Gior's cheek that did not linger long enough to trouble the lines there. They spoke of terms. Then, because the Watch had already whispered itself hoarse on every other thing, the free folk wanted what they had always wanted. Passage south, wood to burn, meat to dry, and the right to sleep without counting axes between their children and the dark. The Watch wanted the realm held safe. Benjen wanted his rangers to return. Gior wanted to die in his bed with a blanket pulled up to his chin and a curse in his mouth at the stupidity of politicians. Eamon wanted men to recall that fear blinded more than age. What I propose, Ned said at last, is a pact sealed at the Night Fort, under the eyes of the old gods and the new that refuse to come there. Let it be known as the Pact of the Wall. The free folk may pass at the gates with names given and numbers recorded. They will lay down their raid and take up their trade. Those who cross will swear to keep the king's peace while they keep their own customs, so long as those customs do not break our common ones. Their chiefs will send hostages of gentle birth to be guest friends of northern houses. Hostages, aye, but honored ones, fosterlings with meat in their bellies and blankets to warm them. In return, the Watch will cease its hunting of those who do not trespass save to trade at appointed places. And the free folk will send men to serve as scouts and guides north of the wall for our rangers, with silver paid them in fair coin from a fund established for the purpose. Benjen's eyes were bright with a light that could have been hope. Gior pulled at his beard and scratched a louse free and pinched it on the table with a pop. You can make a man promise the moon, he said, but he will still sleep in the dark. Who keeps the peace? Once you have it. I do, Ned said. By law and by axe. He did not raise his voice. The hall did not require it. Eamon inclined his head toward the sound of Ned's certainty. If such a thing is to be attempted, it must be backed by more than Winterfell's honor. Men in the south will call this treason to the purpose of the Watch. You will need the king's seal, the hand's voice. Ned's stomach did an old, familiar lurch at the thought of King's Landing, but he did not look away. I will write to Jon Arryn, and to the king if I must. For now, there is a parley to be had. If we can speak to this Mance Rayder and show him that our words have iron in them, the letter will not feel like wind rattling an old shutter. Benjen, can you get me to him? Benjen nodded once. If he wishes to be got to, then let us ask in the proper way. They went up the wall with the moon, a white coin jammed in the sky, and came down into forest that smelled of old teeth. The tunnel gate grumbled open and the bars and switchwork groaned like old bones. Men who had not slept in their own beds in years crossed into the wild as if stepping into a dream they'd had too often and never properly remembered. The trees clutched at them. A fox watched them pass. Somewhere far above, an owl counted out the living with calm arithmetic. They moved with quiet that spoke not only of training but of respect for a place that had killed better men. They made their camp at Whitetree, whose vast pale trunk held a face that had seen more winters than would fit in stories. Benjen built the fire low and mean, the sort you use to warm fingers, not pride. In the morning, the woods gave back the shape of men. They wore furs in mismatched layers and bits of armor hammered from thieves' iron and old kettle lids. A woman with a comb of bones stuck in her hair, as if it might be used at a moment's need to cut a throat, regarded Ned with eyes made narrow by the habit of staring into wind. A man as broad as the great door of the new keep stepped forward with a grin like a cleaver. His breath smoked like the rest, but laughed as if the cold were a woolen joke he had worn out. "Lord of Winter," he said. "Or is that too grand?" And I should call you the man who owns the warmest bed in the north? Tormund, Benjen said behind his teeth, a whisper that was half welcome and half warning. I've been Tormund many things, the big man went on. Tormund Thunderfist, Tormund Giant's babe, though I was only a babe once, and that was long ago. Today I'm only Tormund who has walked far enough to feel there must be a point to walking. Mance says you come with talk that isn't murder dressed in better words. I come with talk that is harder than murder, Ned said. I come to ask if you would hold your hand when it would be easier to swing, and to offer you better prey than ours. A shadow slipped among the bracken. A man with a harp slung across his back as easily as another man might carry a sword. He looked like any other Northman might look if you stole away his livery and polished manners. A man whose eyes went to edges and exits. He wore a cloak stitched from furs that had not come from one beast alone. A strip of red cloth still showed at the hem, a scandal and a joke that only men of the Watch would understand. Mance Rayder, Benjen said, and the name did not sit neatly in his throat. Mance the Dappled, Tormund said cheerfully. He's afraid of pretty things but can't keep away from them. Lord, this is the singer who tells us that when winter comes south, it does not stop to ask which tongues you speak. Mance Rayder smiled as men do when they fear that if they scowl the fear will show. I was taught the tongue of the Watch, he said to Ned. That tongue calls me a deserter, another calls me king. I suppose both are true, and neither is all I am. What do you call me? Stark of Winterfell. A man with sense enough to see profit in survival, Ned said. I call you guest if you will sit near my fire. Mance sat. So did Tormund. So did two women, one tall and wiry with hair the color of autumn bracken, and one younger with eyes that kept returning to Benjen as if the world puzzled her and he was, if not its answer, at least a dependable landmark in it. Rangers fanned out in a posture that said both welcome and we shoot quickly. The Free Folks archers took positions the way water takes a shape when you pour it, the old grace of people who hunt because fasting teaches humility faster than sermons. Ned spoke slowly, because haste belongs to fear. He told them of the gift and the new gift, of fields lying fallow because men had fled them after one raid too many, of the old law that said those lands belonged to the Watch before the Watch stopped having men to tend them. He told them of trading posts under the wall that might be repaved and set to work like teeth put back into a smile. He told them of the king's peace, and heard Tormund snort softly through his nose. He told them he knew men only kept peace because they believed the alternative truly worse. He told them what he had heard in Benjen's letters, and what he had seen with his own eyes 20 years ago in a wood below a mountain pass where a man's blood froze so quickly the steam off his wound looked like prayer. Mance listened the way hunters listen. To the wind, to the ground beneath, to the spaces between words where truth tends to stand while falsehood marches past. You ask me to set the free folk in the king's books like cattle, he said when Ned was done. You ask me to send our children south and call them guest, when what they are is a stone laid against our throat. You ask me to tell men who have never bent their knee that it is no bending if you call it trade. I am telling you the truth of the weather, Ned said. Wind from the east, snow in your teeth, men behind with torches. If you stand here with no hat and call the storm something different, you will still be cold. The younger spearwife leaned forward. You speak as if you know these white shadows. Have you seen them? Ned thought of two bodies in a copse near the Wolfswood, long before he had married, when he had ridden too far in winter had licked at his horse's hooves with a sticky tongue. He thought of a thing that moved as if the world were ice under its feet and the ice was its mother. He thought of an axe that had cracked like glass when it met no meat at all. I have seen enough to say I would not trust any man who told me they were a children's tale, he said. Mance's eyes cut to Benjen. And you, First Ranger? Benjen Rayder did not flinch at the renaming. I have seen prints in snow that end suddenly and then continue again 20 paces away. I have seen a man I knew with a scar across his jaw that he got in a stewpan fight sit up after a week in the cold and try to bite me with lips that were gray as stone. His eyes were. Benjen stared at his own hands. They were not there. Only the blue of sky with all the goodness sucked out of it. Tormund spat a thin line into the snow. We've lost women and boys and good men to the wood that give back nothing but hunger. If you are telling me we can walk south with our children and our old ones under a flag that doesn't turn to piss in the first rain, then say the terms and stop talking to me like a crow with a sermon stuck in his crop. Ned did not smile. Hostages as guest friends. 10 for every 1,000 who cross. You send them to houses I name, and you accept those houses' names as protection for your tents and halls, such as you have them. You accept to trade at the Shadow Tower, at the Bridge of Skulls when we rebuild it, and at Eastwatch where ships can carry fish as well as rumors. You do not raid the new gift. You swear to bring to the watch intelligence of what walks in your nightmare forest, and if they ask for guides north, you provide them. The crown will provide silver for such services. In return, I will ask the king to recognize your crossing as lawful if done by the gate and counted on the books. I will ask him to issue a writ that says those of you who dwell within the gift, under oversight of the watch's stewards, may build and plant legally. You will answer to the laws of the realm and to your own customs insofar as those customs do not break ours. He waited and then did the thing that mattered most. He spoke without threat. If you break the terms, we will hang you as we hang any man who breaks such terms. I will not kill your men as wild men. I will kill them as criminals, and I will write their names before I do it. There is dignity in that, where there is none in being called beasts and hunted. Mance looked into the fire as if it might hide a kinder world. And you put the seal of the South on this? I will put mine, and I will bring you the king's if I can. If I cannot bring the king's seal, you will know by the absence of it that it is not a thing of which I am ashamed. I will sign with my blood at the night fort before a heart tree, and I will ask Maester Eamon to read aloud the terms so no man may later say he misheard. Tormund grinned with the air of a man who likes the sound of his own doom when it is honest. If he breaks his word, Mance, we can always burn the night fort to the ground. Might be the world would thank us for it. The night fort cannot burn, the younger woman said, reverent without knowing why. Mance listened to the wind. The trees gave back nothing, which is their way. He nodded once as if the nod itself weighed as much as a sword. If you mean this oath, Stark of Winterfell, I will bring men to the night fort. I will bring women with red hands who have cut meat from live seals and boys who whittle their own spearheads because they will not trust a man with no songs in him to do it for them. I will bring elders who remember days when the sun barely touched the tops of the trees for a season. I will bring what is left of us that wants to live. But know this, we will come armed. We will come with our own gods. And if a man whose father I don't know lays hands on my sister as if she were a sheep, I will cut his fingers from his hand and feed them to a dog. Then I will have him hung, Ned said. And if it is your brother who lays hands unlawfully on my people, you will give him to me, or I will take him, and I will see to him with the same rope. Law is a road between us, Mance. If we walk it properly, we won't meet in the ditch. They clasped wrists, that old grip that traveled well across tongues. Tormund slapped both men's shoulders and laughed and declared that he would have wine that night even if it had to be made from pine needles. The younger spear wife, whose braid was bound with red thread, relaxed her mouth as if she had been waiting to unclench her jaw for a decade. It would have been sweet if the forest had let them have it so. But sweetness is a spring thing, and they were winter men. The owls stopped counting. The silence turned. The fire's smoke bent as if a hand had pressed on it from above. The horses' eyes went white and rolled. One of them tried to back fully into the fire. Benjen's voice flattened. "Do not run," he said. "Not unless you mean to run forever." They came in a line that had no grace and too much purpose. Men who had been men, shoulders a touch too high, step a touch too slow, flesh stiff with bad dreams. The first wore a leather jerkin that had been good once and now hung off him like old bark. His jaw worked, not with hunger, but as if remembering how to be a jaw at all. His eyes, when they caught the weak light, held the wrong sky. "It's only whites," Tormund said in the tone of a man who talks while his hands remember an old lesson with terror in it. "Only dead men that think they're still owed." "Burn them," someone whispered. "Break them," Benjen said at the same time. Arrows flew. They did not care. They were trees with arrows stuck in them, still walking. a ranger slammed an iron-shod spear into a thing that might once have been a trapper named Kedge. And the spear stuck, and then the shaft jerked, and the skull gaped, and the smell of old cold filled the nose like a prayer said wrong. Tormund barreled into the flank, his axe licking out with a sound like split ice, and a head came free grudgingly. The bodies did not pour blood. They poured a smoke that was not smoke, white and wrong as fallen breath. Ned moved as he had moved when the world had been young and full of banners. He kicked the fire out of its pit with his boot and sent the coals flying into the whites' faces. And in that flailing light he aimed for kneecaps and ankles, and the vulnerable places joints confessionally showed. He hacked. He did not think of honor, because the dead have no honor to spare for the living. The spear wife with the red thread shouted and flung a sack to the ground. It burst and spilled black stone sharp as a curse. "Knife it!" she yelled. "Dragonglass! Knife it, Stark!" Benjen stooped like a boy stealing apples, hands quick and greedy for the chance to live. She tossed him a blade that cut his glove as if air had an edge. Benjen's face lit with a grim joy that made him briefly lovely. He drove the glass into a white's throat. It sounded like snow squealing under a sled runner. The white opened its mouth to sing, and the voice cracked. The head fell soft as rotten wood. Its eyes went dark as wet pitch. They fought to the edge of sense. Then they went beyond it, as men do when the thing before them refuses to be part of the world they know, and so the world must be hammered back into a shape that can be endured. It was quick only in the telling. When it was done, Tormund's beard smoked with someone else's death. Benjen's sleeve hung in ribbons. He did not bleed as much as he should, which worried Ned almost more. The red thread spearwife wiped her blade in the snow and smiled without pleasure. Mance Rayder had not played, but his hand on the harp had been there the whole while, ready to remind men of their reason if they forgot it, as men have often forgotten it moments after saving their lives. "Only whites," Tormund repeated, this time with admiration for the world's cruelty. "If you want the cold boys themselves, you have to go higher and be louder." Ned looked at the bodies, and then past them, and then at the night fort that was not yet in sight but existed for him now as a necessity. "We will be loud enough at the night fort," he said. "Come south under the trees. We'll argue when our hands stop shaking." They came by torch, free folk and rangers together, and the torches ran with grease and bad dreams. The watch's lookouts lowered their bows slowly and then, heart-stoppingly, all at once. The tunnel admitted them like a mouth that did not like the taste. Jeor Mormont stood in the yard with his hands behind him, as if he had been speaking to a room full of ghosts and had found them not rude at all. Eamon's ravens whispered on the rafters. One of them said a word Ned did not wish to hear until he heard it and knew it could be bent to a better purpose. "King," the raven croaked. "King, king." "It is an old word here," Eamon said when Ned looked. "It has roots deeper than ours. Do not be afraid of it. Make it kneel to law." Letters went out. Maester Eamon wrote in a hand that had once charmed masters in the south and now charmed ravens into thinking knights were smaller than they were. Ned slept as men sleep who earn it. When he woke, there was frost like hoarfire on the sill, and the sense that around them history had turned over like a man in his sleep and exposed a new skin. King's Landing answered with the indifference of a place that cannot see farther than its own walls unless the smoke carries news fit for scandal. It was John Arryn's hand that moved the realm's machine. The hand of the king read with the care a mason gives to a faulty stone. He weighed not only the proposal but the man who had made it. He sat by a south window whose weak heat broke only the gentler edge of winter and thought of a boy who had been his fosterling, who had grown into a man who cut his bread precisely and kept his promises like other men kept coin. In the throne room, Robert Baratheon laughed with a noise that shook dust from old banners. "Wildlings at my wall?" he said. "They'll piss on the floor, John, and call it wine. They will if no one tells them the difference and makes them pay for the mop," John said. "He asks not for surrender but for structure. If the Night's Watch supports it, if the Warden of the North will stand between king and chaos, as he has always done, then this is less a treaty with raiders than a labor draft writ for the living who wish to continue being so." "Do you know," Robert said, scratching under his beard with a fingertip that was more jewel than a soldier's nail should be, When I first met Eddard, he thought a joke was a sin and a sin a joke. He is a hard man, but he is even-handed. If he says the wall will stand better with these, what do they call themselves? The free folk, Pycelle interjected, with the look of a cat who wanted to be petted for remembering the sauce dish. Free folk, Robert repeated, amused. Let us see if they stay free when they meet a taxman. A letter, John. Give him my seal to sit on the night fort so long as he sits on Mormont's. If it fails, I will drink to his effort. If it works, I will drink to his cleverness. I will drink either way, so the realm may as well benefit from my habits. Pycelle worried that the watch's vows would be stained by commerce and politics. Varys smiled like a fox that had learned to wear boots. When men are hungry, they break laws to eat, he said softly. When men are fed, they make laws to eat more. Let Lord Stark feed them prongs that aim north. Let him spend the king's silver in a place where I do not often have opportunity to spend it. I am curious what may grow. Cersei watched with eyes that learned not to move too much lest a man notice their movement and be offended by not being its subject. She thought the North should mind its own cold. She thought free men with knives grew into problems if you watered them with courtesy. But even a queen's disfavor blows colder than law, not as strong. She dipped a pen in a red well and watched the hand scratch words that would travel farther than the sound of his voice and work more mischief too. So the realm's grudging assent gathered like a cloud, and in the north they said that meant rain, and in the south they said that meant a quill carver would need more goose feathers, and both were right. Ned stood beneath the night fort and felt the weight of the place as if it had thought of him by name. The castle had the bad habit old places have of making men speak softly. Even Tormund's cheer grew narrower here, like a river forced into a canyon. The door in the well, the one that was not a door, stared back with a wooden face that had not changed its expression even when boys once threw pebbles to see if it would blink. Maester Aemon was not there to descend. He stood in the yard with Gior, both cloaked in crowblack. The God's Wood was a huddle of iced reeds, and the heart tree, gnarled as a cripple's hand, showed red tears that had no water in them, only the suggestion of old hurt. They gathered anyway, because men must name their moments as well as their children if they wish to remember them. Free folk stood with shoulders touching like cattle in a winter storm, their faces like old leather, the young ones bright as new-forged knives. On the other side, men of the watch stood with their pride making crows of them in a place where the only birds were those that never flew south. Northern lords gathered in furs and suspicion. Great John Umber with his voice like a drum in a hollow, and envoys from Carhold, bleak and pale as ice, and a Manderly dressed in cloth of silver that shivered even when he did not. The flayed man of the Dreadfort did not fly. Roose Bolton had sent no man to stand where law might require him to speak too clearly later. That was Roose's way, the silence where his standard might have been felt like a thing with breath. Speak your terms, Gior said, and you, Raider, speak yours. Then I will use the sense the wall left me, and we will do the thing that needs doing, even if we do not like it. Ned spoke them, the terms with which he had toasted bitter bread and warmed stiff fingers. He spoke them as if they were already ancient, on purpose, so men might hear in them not novelty but continuity. Mance spoke in return, and his words carried the weight of men who listened to him because he told them the truth about danger and made them laugh when there was no cause. When the time came to sign, Ned stepped forward with a knife. He pricked his thumb, watched the bead of blood appear, red and gamely living in all this white and gray, and pressed it to the parchment where his name lay in ink like any other man's. Gior Mormont signed beneath him with a hand that shook and then did not. Aemon pressed a dab of wax with the mark kept for the watch's old rights in the gift. The Manderly envoy witnessed with a flourish that made some men roll their eyes. Great John Umber scrawled in a hand blunt as his finger and breathed, "If this breaks, I will break it harder." Mance Raider drew a cross of his own making, because he did not claim letters, and Dalla, who had come late and stood with a hand on her belly as if it were a secret she was trying to keep from herself, touched the parchment too with her finger. It was not required. The free folk murmured, and something like superstition broke, and something like hope took a step forward in its place. A gust came then that rattled banners on the far towers and stirred the red leaves at the heart tree. The ravens in the rafters shifted as one creature. One said the old word again. "King." "Not here," Ned said, smiling despite himself. "No kings here, only law." He had thought the signing would be the whole of it because he had wanted to be a man who believed that. But law is a kind of road, and a road invites travel. What came after asked just as much. The first to test their pride were not free folk but men of the new gift who had lost sheep and cousins to raiders and built grievance like a wall inside their ribs until it seemed the only good architecture left in them. They watched women walk through the gate with babies bound to their backs and refused to see the babies for what they were. They saw raiders where there were only hunters. They saw thieves where there were only men who had learned to look hard at everything because anything soft had been taken from them by winter itself. At a little place called Crow Slope, a boy named Daniel, whose father had been killed at a still in the wood, borrowed his uncle's sword and put it through a woman's leg because her skin was no color he was used to. He did it in the shadow of a trading post opened by the watch, beneath a new sign made by a builder who took pride in straight letters. He did it because grief had no mouth and he thought his hand could be won. The spear wife did not scream, though her face twisted like leather whose owner wanted to teach it a new shape. Her husband broke Daniel's wrist on his own knee and would have laid his head in the mud if Tormund's voice had not thundered across the clearing like a winter storm rolling down the mountain. "No," Tormund said, and it was not the no of a man whose authority rests on agreements. It was a father's no and a brother's, and the sort you do not disobey because the old world will whip you for it even if the new one does not. "Not today, not ever if we can help it." Ned rode out from Winterfell with 24 men and a law in his pocket like a whetstone. He found the boy and the spearwife and the husband who had not killed a boy despite a new law that would have looked the other way if he had done it. He heard their accounts. He weighed them with less than a day and more than prejudice. He had his men seize the boy and bring him to the post, and he stood him in the dust with his broken wrists splinted and his lips chapped. "You thought our law stopped where you stood," Ned told him. "It does not. It is bigger than your rage. You will lose your sword hand for this if I choose to make example. But you will not lose it today. You will work for the man whose wife you crippled until he tells me he is satisfied. You will pay him in labor the coin you cannot carry in your broken hand. If you touch a free folk child or woman again in anger, I will cut off the hand you have left and feed it to Tormund's dog." The husband stared at Ned like a man who had just seen the trick behind a famed magician. Then he nodded. "Good," he said, his voice low and astonished. "Good." The trade posts began to live. Men who had once killed to eat now swore to bring only wood and leather and meat to a table where coins clinked. A Manderley factor set up a ledger at Eastwatch and wore sealskin boots under his silk because he was not a fool and flattery does not keep toes from falling off. At the Shadow Tower, a half-cracked bridge became a place where men told stories that were not all lies. It did not remove the fear. Nothing in life removes fear. But it put it in a ledger and wrote a column beside it titled Provision. That is a kind of safety no knight's arm can purchase. The watch changed too, as men do when asked to look at a thing that frightens them more boldly than the fear had taught them. Bowen Marsh took to scowling as if it might pay him a wage. "We have a wall to keep," he said often, to anyone who would listen. "We are not customs men." "You are what is needed," Gior replied. "Today, the realm needs customs men with better swords." He did not win Bowen, who counted the grain in his mind and dreamed of empty larders, but neither did he lose him. The man did his work even when doing it made him shake with the sense that he was standing on a deck that tilted. Corn Halfhand showed men how to read snow and how to remember the shape of a tree at dawn, so that at dusk it would not look like a man with a blade. He said, "Free folk without bitterness." Alistair Thorne said, "Wildling with pride," as if scorn were the last possession of a poor noble, and he would spend it carefully rather than admit he had none. Ben-Jen went north with Tormund and a handful of young guides who were not yet proud of their scars because they had not learned to like them. They vanished into forest and wind. Sometimes they sent word back. Dragonglass mined from a hill of old bones where a camp had been made not by men but by forgetting. Lights seen on a ridge like a line of ghosts carrying lanterns. Sometimes they did not send word back for too long and the watch learned to wait like a man with a boil weights on his healer. A month later, a crow came with one rag tied to its leg, Not a letter, just a strip of Mance's cloak that had once been white. It smelled faintly of smoke and something like mint. Men said too many things. South, at White Harbor, Wyman Manderley made friends with any new coin that could be taught to sing on a table. "We will ship what they fish and buy the bones too and make glue," he said, his eyes merry as a winter feast for the poor. "We will sell them new nets and new knives and take their pelts. We will send our fattest cargoes north so their bellies learn to love us. When winter comes by sea, and we will know the water by name, and that will be our greatest advantage." "You are a merchant, Cat," Ellen said when his letter came to Winterfell detailing quantities no heart could pretend to keep in memory. "I had not thought to be so grateful to a merchant." "Do not be grateful to me," Wyman had written, as if he had heard her. "Be grateful to the man who put a table down where all our resentments could be weighed fairly." Dissent grew in the shadow of the peace because anything worth having casts a shadow. Great John Umber drank much and shouted more and called Mance a king in the wrong place in front of men who did not like their voices to go around corners without them. He did not break faith. He boasted of not breaking it. But Great John was not the North. There were quiet men who sharpened knives and said what they had always said, that men who took no knee would not respect law, that free folk would breed faster than wolves if you gave them sheep, that the Watch's oath did not mention tariffs and that made tariffs suspect. Ned heard them all. He did not attempt to drown their noise in louder noise. He let law sit like a stone and did not lift it except to weigh men's claims beneath it. It was not enough to save everyone. At a farm the free folk called Hollow Hill for the way the wind moaned beneath it, Benjen and Tormund found a circle of trees with rotten prayer flags bound to their branches and a dead child someone had left like a question. The child was not frozen. His flesh was supple as if sleep had held him and refused to let go. Benjen's gloves creaked when he lifted him. "He's warm," Tormund whispered, his voice coming from a chest that did not belong to a whispering man. "In this cold." A shape moved in the shade beyond, not light, but the apology of light. The horses danced. Benjen's hand fell to the dragonglass knife as if it had been made as an extension of his knuckles. He did not cry out. Men who have been boys with small bruises learn to go quiet when pain comes, because shouting only makes it come more frequently. The thing that moved did not make sound. The world made a sound around it. Tormund threw a torch and it went out in the air. That burst of dark was more terrible than when men closed their eyes in prayer. Benjen did not wait for a better chance. He lunged, and his blade bit the shoulder of something that was not flesh and did not like that truth. It recoiled with no noise and yet all the noise. Ice crystals formed on Benjen's beard and cracked and slid down to his collar in chips. Tormund swung his axe and found the trunk of a tree instead. The tree did not complain, which almost undid him. Later, when they were alive because they had been lucky or the world had been undecided, Benjen sat with his back to a rock and breathed in a measured way. He did not tell Tormund he had seen eyes in that thing that did not belong to any creature but the sky. He did not tell him that his arm had hurt as if he had thrust it into a river that hated him. The child they buried with more ceremony than most kings receive. Somewhere below, the pact held. The men who enforced it were small. The thing above did not care and yet cared very much that they existed at all. Hardhome burned a little the way a pan in which the fat catches fire does. It had been a rumor for months, a place that refused to be an actual place in the way numbers in a ledger are precise, useful liars. As rumors do when fed on fear, it fattened. The free folk spoke of smoke seen at dawn like a sigh. Men glimpsed ships where there ought not to be ships. Black shapes that floated slower than thought permits. The ones who came from that place did not blink often enough. They smelled of salt and a mold that grows on old meat. They were grateful, but when they slept they made fists, which is not the way grateful people sleep. Ships? Wyman Manderley wrote in a hand, dragging slightly, as if he had meant to fill in every loop more finely, and the quill had refused. If they are frightened of water, we must put a horn in their mouths and make them love it. He did more than write. He fitted out 3 hulks he had meant to send whale fishing and sent them north with pilots who knew enough to hug the coast and not enough to be afraid of the things the old charts left blank. He wrote to Ned that he had hired men with arms like ropes and heads built for butting. and he had hired women who made rope and told stories and kept men's hands busy when their minds threatened to break from too many dark horizons. He sent barley and smoked fish and limes because a man cannot resist a lime if he has been too long on salt water. Its tartness tastes like not dying. Ned rode to Eastwatch to watch them go, because men should witness what they ask other men to risk on their behalf. Cotter Pike cursed wind, rope, his men, Wyman Manderley's soft southern ways, and the very idea of law. He captained anyway. When the ships went out, the waves slapped their sides with hands too big to be comfort. Ned stood with a scarf over his mouth and understood for the first time that everything he had been doing was meant to put brave men in places where brave men had always died, and give them a better chance of doing it usefully. They saved hundreds. They did not save more than that. Free folk came aboard with faces still pinched in from years of starving and told stories of things that came out of fog so pale you could only see them when you tried not to. They told of fish that floated belly up under a skin of ice in a summer month. They told of white bears, bigger than the ones free folk had always sworn by, coming down to the shore and looking at them as if choosing. They did not sing much on those ships. They counted their children. They did not count the old ones because they had learned not to. When they reached Eastwatch, I am told some of them fell to their knees and kissed the boards, and some of them spat because spitting is how a man tells the world he is still greater than the thing that almost broke him. Law bent to the rescue. Not entirely. Enough. Ned stood in the yard and watched as a boy with hair like a raven's leg was given to the care of a steward with warm hands, and as a woman whose teeth had rotted in the cold was given a blanket that had belonged to a man who had died 2 winters ago and had been too stubborn to be buried properly. Felt like stealing from a dead friend. It also felt like right work. Men who had fought to prevent the Pact lent their shoulders to a crate. It is this, Ned thought. Not the parchment, not the seal, the seeing. The trouble came, like so many troubles, not from the free folk who had most to gain, but from men in the north who felt suddenly small in the largeness of a change. A cousin to a Serwyn struck a man of the free folk in the yard of a posting at Queen's Crown and called him a thief when what had been stolen was certainty. The man of the free folk, a willow of a hunter with only one glove because the other hand had lost 3 fingers to a winter he preferred not to discuss, knocked him down and then helped him up and said in a voice that could have been his father's voice if the north had been kinder, "If you do not like this, come back in a year and see if you cannot bear it now that your wife's cousin is not dead on your lawn because he tried to steal a chicken and got shot for it." The Serwyn cousin did not return. He found a field that needed plowing and turned earth instead of men. This is how change survives, by finding hands already busy. Benjen did not return. Word came of him the way word comes of men the woods loves. Some said he had found a cave and learned to walk the old paths under the snow. Some said he had been seen in the tops of ironwood trees like a crow, and if you looked down the trunk there was no ladder. Some said he had been lost. Tormund shrugged as if to keep grief from settling on his shoulders. "If the wood took him," he told Ned softly when they stood on the wall with the wind in their mouths and the sun a small, white thing trying not to drop. "I like to think it done it because it needed him. It's a selfish thought. It has kept me alive. Be selfish like me for once, Stark. Think the wood wanted him more than you and be proud you kept him sweet for so long." In Winterfell's God's Wood, Ned knelt in the snow with his gloves off and his hands in the water of the pool. The cold bit his skin like a familiar hound. He made no pious speeches. The old gods prefer men who do not chatter. He thought of the Pact as if it were a living family with one leg shorter than the other and a habit of favoring it. He thought of the doors it had opened. He thought of Jon, quiet as winter sunlight and observing more than a boy should have to. He thought of Robb, whose anger came and went like a gust and left kindness behind him like a track. He thought of Sansa's needlework and Arya's refusal to hold still, of Bran's laughter in the galleries where drafts played at war. He thought of Catspaws and Winter and Law. He told the heart tree nothing it did not know. Yet after, when he lifted his hands, the water dripped from his fingers like promises and did not freeze before it fell. They tried him with a murder that needed solving. A free folk woman named Brella was found with her head staved in behind the back of a tavern near the Shadow Tower. It was a bad tavern and a worse alley. She had traded dried fish and taken her pay in coin and in the right to sleep under a roof. She had left and not returned. Her brother found her and did some damage to the tavern sign with his knife before men restrained him. Rumors bred. Some said a man of the watch. Some said a northern lordling whose sword wore silver well. A boy came forward with a tail big as his hand. He had seen a shadow and then more shadows and then the sound of a door shutting. Ned came to the place where she had died and waited in the mud as if he could make time explain itself. He looked at the wall for scuff marks. He looked at the boot prints, which the watch's builders had marked with string. He asked the free folk brother and the boy and the tavern keeper and his wife who had found the body. He sat beside the woman's corpse, hair matted on one side where blood had glued it, and thought of Caitlyn's hair like river water, and that made something in him stand up as it had stood up when he had read Benjen's first letter. The killer was a boy of the watch who had come north to save his life from a thief's rope and had found that some men cannot be saved. They can only be moved where their breaking does less harm. His name was Jaren. He had a face that looked like it might be handsome in 15 years and a mouth full of rot now. He wept in the yard when they dragged him out and wept after and before and during his attempt to tell a story that would make this not his fault. It was not rage. It was fear like a rat in his gut. It had seen this woman go under the eaves of the tavern and had told him tales. He had hit her with a plank he found leaning. He had not meant to kill her, he said. He had meant only to make his fear shut up for a moment. It had shut up. So had she. They hung him before sundown, because law requires swiftness when it can have it and certainty always. The free folk brother watched and did not smile. He did not cry either. His face had blown smooth, like slate on which men write too often and too hard. He went away. The tavern keeper paid a fine and had his men fix the place where the plank had leaned so that men could not get at it so easily. That night it snowed with small, soft flakes that cushioned nothing. Ned went to the godswood again and did not explain it to the gods because that is not a son's place. He told Caitlyn instead, and she told him that sometimes you cannot stop a thing, you can only catch it after and keep it from gaining friends. Robert wrote again, a letter full of jokes and wine stains, and said that lords in the south spoke of the northern folly as if they were men discussing a ship that had been built to sail on land. Let them talk, Robert wrote. If it fails, they will be happy to have me scold you. If it works, they will say they suggested it first. I find I care only about the drink in my cup and whether my sons can keep their hands to themselves. The rest is your province, and that's why I kept you alive. P.S. If your free friends ever send you whale, for the love you still bear me, send some south. He sent a cask of pickled whale that turned by the time it reached the Red Keep and a loaf of bread the size of a boy that went stale at Maidenpool because the sea had thought about eating the ship and then decided not to. He sent Law with his seal and men to read it in places where men used to read only weather. Caitlyn made it sleep beside her on the shelf above the hearth. Arya asked if the Law had teeth. She touched the wax with a fingertip and left no mark because the wax had been fire once and had not forgotten how to harden. Ned rode out again and became in those months less a lord and more a visible Law. He was careful of it. Law does not like to be seen pleasing one man more than another. It likes to sit like stone, patient and clean. He did speak to Mance under the shadow of a watch beacon that had not been lit and found the man thinner. Dalla was heavy with child and smiled as if all the world were a joke she understood. Tormund declared he had seen Benjen in a dream where they had both been young and much stupider. We tried to ride a bear, he said. It was exactly as wise as it sounds. If I die, tell everyone I didn't make the same mistake twice. Except for the ones that I liked. East of the wall, near the Frostfangs, a party of guides failed to return after 6 days, turned into 10, then into 20. Corin Halfhand went after them with 2 men and a boy who had only just learned how to keep his fingers from going dead. He returned with the boy and without his men and with the sort of frostburn on his cheek that changes a man's face in a way no singer can like. He sat in Gior's hall and drank and said to no one in particular, "If we had not had the free folk with us last winter, we'd have lost 2 dozen. They knew which ridges to trust. I will go with them again once my cheek is done being a map." Bowen Marsh scowled until his face was a lesson in what scowling can and cannot do. "In my day," he said, "the free folk were our enemies and it made the world simpler. Simpler is warmer. In your day, Gior said, weariness and honest seed. You had 300 more men to garrison the castles and frost that knew its place. In my day, the wind comes out of the east in a month that ought not to have wind at all. He rubbed his face. I have made mistakes. This does not feel like one. Eamon lifted his head. What I have seen, he offered, is that men who will fight together against common fear learn to share food and water without being told. It does not turn enemies into friends, but it becomes harder to call a man beast when you have shared your last drop. The winter broke earlier than it should have, then returned with meanness, then softened with false promises, then returned again as if ashamed of its softness. In those jags of thaw, men planted beans in beds they had cleared by law and by hard work. Children who had been cold their whole remembered lives learned the luxury of a fever that broke after 3 days because a maester's kit was within walk. A spear wife from the Frostfangs married a man from the Rills, and they argued over where to keep their charcoal. A boy from Queen's Crown learned to sing while he carried nets, and when Mance heard him he smiled and refused to teach him an old song, saying, "Leave the old songs for the old mouths," and taught him instead a new one about law that was not very good until the boy made it so. Not all men learned. Some die as they are. A band styled the Ragged Hand began to ride the edge of the gift, wearing bits of armor and stolen capes, like crows who had tried on a peacock's feathers and kept them even when the joke died. They murdered 2 men outside the Shadow Tower and called the dead men thieves in a chalk scrawl on the stones, as if chalk could swear. Ned took men and hunted them through the woods in a fashion that made his lungs burn and his joints speak of years. He took them prisoner because that is what law requires when it can, and he had them judged where men could see. He hung their leader who had 3 children who thought he was a hero. He stood beside the boy while they dropped the gate, and he did not hold his hand nor look away. He did not sleep well that night because sleeping well after such things is a kind of sin, but he slept briefly and without dreams and woke to do the next right thing. It was Tormund who brought him the news when Dallas' child was born. He came into Winterfell's great hall unannounced, as if law was something he wore like a new cloak and had yet to grow to. Men's hands went to dagger hilts until he laughed and threw his arms wide and bellowed, "A boy, or a girl, a child. It has lungs like a piper. Mance is insufferable, and I love him like a goat I cannot sell." He demanded wine and got it and drank to the law and to the old gods and to the new and to the night fort and to whoever had invented letting women scream inside instead of out on the snow where wolves would learn to love the sound. Ned went north to see the child and found Mance with an expression like a man who has learned a secret that makes nothing easier and everything more worthwhile. Dalla held the baby like a drought holds rain. Her hair was slick with sweat and her smile had a familiarity to it that made Ned ache for his own children. "We will call him Edric," she said, because the quiet kindness that had built all this should be honored. Mance frowned and then laughed because he knew when a woman's mind was not to be changed for love or war. "You will keep him safe," Ned told her, which was the sort of lie a father must tell a mother. "There is law now. There is winter too," Dalla said, and looked at him with pity that did not feel like insult, only like the honest measure of the world. He left gifts, salt and a finely worked knife and a blanket ribbed by Caitlyn's own hands, and he rode back with his men and thought, as fathers think, about how many ways the world can end and how few begin. The snow came heavier that year as if to challenge the law. It settled on the wall's crown in drifts that would have buried castles in the south and hissed down the flues of the night fort like a snake that had learned a chant. Scout parties grew thin. A boy took a dragonglass dagger in a fight he did not understand and cut his own thumb open. It burned blue for a heartbeat and then went dark, and he would not speak for a week. The builders repaired a tower under Eastwatch with stones that were warmer than they had any right to be, and when Maester Harmune touched them he drew back as if scorched and would not tell anyone what he had felt. Men whispered of a white ranger seen along the foot of the Frostfangs with a cloak made of thin ice that moved in breezes there were not. Gior stopped laughing at things he had once laughed at and began to laugh at new things, which is the surest sign a man knows fear and has not told it to sit in another man's lap. Then, when men had grown used to this as the new shape of their days, the world within the world shifted. A storm rolled down off the high places as if a giant had exhaled after holding his breath for a century. The sky whitened. The cold had a sound to it. The thing that walked under it was not a storm and not a man. It was the idea that men had once held at the back of their throats and had spat out as mince tails when they learned iron. It spoke without voice, in the way that ice speaks to the river beneath it. Men heard because they had ears, and then men who had no ears heard, and then the law heard too and had to stand like a post and see if it could keep rope from breaking. They came at the night fort because it belonged to the old world, and the old world does not forgive. The gate carved in the weirwood face opened and said a word men did not want to hear anymore because they were tired and had heard too much. Mance Rayder stood with his sword bare and his eyes bright and his mouth, God help him, curved as if he might sing in the middle of this. Tormund took axes in both hands and put himself where the line was fattest. Jeor Mormont's stance said he expected this and had no right to complain. Ned stood with his men of Winterfell behind him and the law in his bones as if it were marrow. Aemon walked forward, blind and unafraid, and whispered something into the well that was not a well, and the whisper came back colder but the same. They were few because such things are always few. They do not need to be many. They moved with that awful grace that makes a man think of glass until it breaks him. The first to reach the stones made them crack, not from weight, but from the truth of a cold that had never before touched those stones, not even in the winter of old tales. The men under Ned did not run because no one ran where he could see. They threw fire that went out and then burned again because someone's prayer had been stubborn enough to leave a coal. The dragonglass killed, but the killing felt wrong, like tearing silk that had belonged to a bride. The whites came thicker. They always come where courage makes more courage necessary. For a time it was just the work of hands and arms and legs. Then it was the work of something that had nothing to do with hands and arms and legs at all. Aemon lifted his face. He called a name in a voice that had forgotten itself 100 winters ago. No one heard it but the wood, which shuddered like a thing waking. The heart tree did not bleed. It simply stood more completely. Its red eyes did not flare. They watched. Ned felt, all at once, that he was not alone in the world as he had often feared. Not only because of the men at his shoulder, but because the world itself had decided in this hour not to be absent. The others, which is what the free folk named them when white shadows grew tiresome, hesitated in a way that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with recognition. The law stood. It was not a flexible thing. It was a post set so deep that even winter had to go around it a little. That was all. It was enough. Tormund's axe found a neck that had never before admitted to having one. Mance sang, and it sounded like a sword sharpening. Jeor cursed, and it sounded like justice. Ned struck at ice with glass and learned he could hate and love the act in a single breath. When it ended like all battles end. With men unsure whether they had lived because they deserved to or because the world had rolled on a fraction and crushed another under its weight. The night fort did not burn. The weirwood did not speak in any tongue but the one wind speaks. Aemon sat down on the cold stone as if he had used up his years hurriedly. Mance wiped his sword on his leg and looked to Dalla, who held Edric close beneath a fir and had not closed her eyes once. Tormund's laugh sounded like a bark in a destroyed hall, too big for the room. Ned blinked and saw, not with his eyes, that the choice he had made to sign the pact had drawn not only men, but other things to their side, if only to watch. The old world had given them permission to be brave together. The months after were not easy. Nothing is easy that is worth the telling. Men continued to break law as if they had not been present when law saved them. The watch lost men to cold and to misstep and to the argument the body makes with exhaustion and at last wins. The free folk pushed where boundaries were soft, as men will. Northern lords grumbled and drank and then worked because there were fences whose rails had loosened and children who needed learning. Catelyn had Sansa embroider a new banner for the Pact, a field of white crossed by black and red lines, not elegant, but strong. She did not raise it from the battlements. She hung it above their own hearth and told Arya to respect it even when she wished to cut it to pieces and make a tent of it. Ned sat with Maester Luwin many nights and wrote to Jon Arryn and to Wyman and to Mormont and to those small places in the Gift that had not known for years that the North cared if they lived or died. He went back and forth to Castle Black so often that his horse learned the path and could pick her way by starlight. He grew a new habit of rubbing his thumb where he had pricked it to sign the pact, a kind of quiet counting. He watched Jon Snow watch the world and wondered what he would become in a realm that now had a slightly different shape than the one he had been meant for. When the deep of winter came, the free folk brought with them stories of old pacts on islands with trees whose faces were very clear. They understood this new pact in their own words. It mattered less than its keeping. They learned a little law. Men of the Watch learned a little laughter that was not cruel. Northern lords learned what happens to blood when it is made to sit beside a fire with new blood and not be killed for it. It warms because it must. And the others learned that there is a new thing in the world. Not stronger than winter, never that, but straighter, like a spear that will not bend even when it would be more convenient to break. On the last day of a year that had felt out of order, Ned stood on the wall and looked north. The wind wrote him a letter on his face. He closed his eyes to read it properly, said nothing kind. It did not need to. He had not made the world kind. He had made it bearable here, in this strip where law and necessity had kissed awkwardly and then discovered they did not mind the other's mouth. He thought of Ben-Jen somewhere under the snow, perhaps, or nowhere, or everywhere the snow was. He thought of the night fort and the way the old wood had been willing, that one time, not to be absent. He thought of a child named Edric who had been born in a world that was not the one his father had been born into and who might, as a result, be someone different than he might otherwise have been. "What do you see?" Gior asked him, a gruff man's gruff question. "I see a road," Ned said, because everything in his life seemed to come to that. "It is narrow. It is icy. It runs along a drop that will not forgive. But it holds. We have set stones. We have tied ropes. Men go by it who would not have dared last year. Some will fall. The rest will cross." Gior grunted, which was praise. Eamon's smiles were quieter, and he gave one then, where the blind can aim a smile without shame. Tormund shouted from the yard, demanding food enough for 10 bears and swearing he would beat the wall with his fists if it did not feed him. Mance's song drifted thinly upward, only snatches, because the wind stole the rest. Ned stood until his feet numbed and his eyes watered, and then he went down. There was always work to be done where men had chosen not to be beasts. And there was law, and there was winter, and there was, between them, a pact signed with blood that had not frozen. He carried that knowledge like a warm stone in his pocket as he walked, and it warmed him more than he would admit to any man who would tell stories about it later. In the southern courts, they called it an experiment with a curl of the lip. In the north, they called it a road with stones. At the wall, they called it survival. In the woods, where no one names anything until they have to, they did not call it anything. But when the wind moved through certain groves, some men said the leaves made a sound that was not only the sound of leaves. It sounded, if you laid your ear to the right bark, like a word you might say when someone offers you a cup of water and you have been thirsty too long to remember how to be proud. Yes. Years later, when boys told it to each other in beds where the straw was clean and the blankets only smelled of men, not rot, they left out much and added more. They spoke of a lord of Winterfell who had set his own blood on a page, and in doing so had put a hand on a serpent and not been bitten. They spoke of Tormund who laughed and Mance who sang and Gior who cussed and Aemon who whispered to trees. Some finished it by saying that winter never truly came, as if the world had been changed in its bones. The better ones, the ones who had listened to old men wheeze and not only to each other's boast, said that winter came as winter always does. But when it came, there were more men in the yard, and the wall did not creak as much, and the dead did not own quite so much laughter as they had once owned. That was all. It was enough. Ned never told his children that he was afraid. He told them the law and where it came from. He told them to put stones on their grandmother's cairn and to stay out of the kitchens when the cooks were in a mood. He told Jon that there are roads you must walk because you put them there. He told Robb that anger is a horse with a bad mouth that will bolt if not handled. He told Sansa to iron her dignity as carefully as a veil. He told Arya to keep her knife sharp and her temper dull. He told Bran to climb only where the stones were honest. He held their heads when they hurt. He did not tell them he had made a pact with men who had once been his enemies because they had all together a bigger enemy now. He did not tell them because he wanted them to grow up thinking enemies were simpler than that, until the day they had to learn otherwise and could pay for the knowledge under decent terms. At nights, when Caitlin lay with her head on his chest and the cold tapped at the shutters the way it had learned to do to remind men they were small, he would tell her a piece of it and she would tell him to sleep. He would sleep then. Men who live in laws sleep better than men who live in fear. When he dreamed, if he dreamed, he did not dream of white shadows. He dreamed of stones set in ice like steps, and of boys and girls stepping carefully from one to the next, and of a hand that came out of the dark when one of them slipped, and of that hand catching even when it could not see. He dreamed of winter as a road, not a wall. He dreamed of what they had done together, and he knew it was neither salvation nor folly but something harder and better that often contains a piece of both. The night before the next winter proper, Tormund came again, his beard in want of an audience, and declared that he had killed a boar so large he had had to make a boat from its hide to carry all the meat. He handed Arya a tusk and she tried to hide it under her skirt. Caitlin made her give it to Maester Luwin for medicine and Arya sulked. Mance sang in the yard, a tune that had learned new words since the old words had worn out their shoes. The Raventree ravens called to each other across roofs and courtyards and made a nuisance of themselves on a scale only the North could suffer with humor. Jeor Mormont sent word that the Shadow Tower needed nails and men. Wyman Manderley sent coin with a note to say there was no point hoarding it if his grandson meant to eat it anyway. Roose Bolton did not write. Stannis, who had missed the chance to say something cruel about the North, saved his breath and burned it eventually somewhere less windy. The world did not tilt. It threw its weather as it always does, and men bent under it and then straightened. When at last the long night touched the North in honest strength, when fires burned without joy and men began to forget the taste of fresh fruit as they always do when the harvest fails and the apples go sweet in their dreams, the free folk came to the wall with axes and stood in front of farmers whose fathers they had once robbed and said, "Today we are neighbors." The watch took their places and measured the threat and did not blink. The North did what it has always done, endured, and in enduring, gave the South bravery it would not otherwise have possessed. Law stood, frayed, patched, sometimes soaked with tears, never irreparably torn. Men broke and mended as men break and mend. The Pact of the Wall held, not because it was magic, because it was work. And in the deep hours when cold finds a way through tapestries and under doors and into bones, when even lords dream like hungry common men, the heart trees hummed. Some said that if you pressed your ear to their bark you would hear a soft exchange. Not words, because words are the South's business, but a kind of assent passing between root and snow and breath, as if the old world, in its own untranslatable way, had decided that for now this was good. As if it had looked on a handful of cold men with tired arms and had recognized itself not in their swords or their banners, but in the honest attempt to put a straight line through winter and ask the world to allow it. Ned Stark, who had believed in roads and laws since boyhood, who had learned that mercy is not the enemy of law but its furniture, grew older in a world thread by the pact he had signed. He buried men he loved and pardoned men who did not deserve it until they did. He rode to the wall as other men ride to market or to weddings. He never again said wildling for free folk without hearing his own scorn and dismissing it as an old coat he did not need. When he died years hence, not by treachery at a king's hand but by winter, as is the North's right, men told the story of the day he set his blood on a page and called it nothing more than keeping a ledger up to date. That modesty was part of why the story stayed true. The Pact outlived heroes and villains because it was made of something plainer than both need and the courage to admit to it together. In later summers, children played at the night fort in years when the watch was drunk enough to pretend this was wise. They ran fingers along old carvings and dared each other to whisper to the well. Some swore they heard a word answer, king or law or yes. They spooked each other with tales of white ghosts and red-eyed trees and crows with men's voices. They grew up and learned the weight of a ledger and a spear. They taught their children to step carefully on ice and to offer a hand when another foot slipped. They taught them a song that was not very good until the right voices sang it, about a wall that had learned to be a road without ceasing to be a wall, about men who had learned to be neighbors without ceasing to be themselves, and about winter, which will always come, and the thing we do together, which will always matter more.